All right, hello, ladies and gents. We are taking a look at the New Deal notes. We're continuing from where we left off. So, last time that we talked, we were talking about the first New Deal as a response to the Great Depression. So, FDR's plan to try to help the country out a little bit in the Great Depression itself. And we had gone over several first New Deal agencies, including some regulatory ones like the FDIC and the SEC, and some that were aimed at providing jobs, like the CCC, and then some of this last set that we did here were like agricultural relief. So we had talked about, let's go back here, we had talked about like the Soil Conservation Service, the Agricultural Adjustment Agency, and we ended with the Tennessee Valley Authority, arguably one of the most radical programs of the first New Deal. So the first New Deal programs mostly roll out within the first 100 days of Roosevelt's administration, if that actually becomes kind of like a standard for like how much a president's getting done after Roosevelt, because he does so much in those first 100 days. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take like a quick swing through a couple of different identity groups in American history and sort of see how the New Deal impacted them. So first up, the Native Americans. The last time that you guys really looked at Native Americans, what you were talking about was like closing of the West, and like the Dawes Act and kind of the reservation system and like the whole closing of the frontier, the Indian Wars, all of that type of stuff. So that was about 50 years ago at this point, right? Wounded Knee was 1890. The Battle of Little Bighorn was 1876. So under the New Deal and under FDR, what we see for the first time in about a generation, about 50 years, is the government sort of stepping forward and trying to make some changes in like general Native American policy. The Indian Reorganization Act, it's also called the Wheeler-Howard Act, repeals that old Dawes Severalty Act from back in 1887, or at least it repeals parts of it. So you may remember that the Dawes Act like took reservation land and divided it up into small homesteads. This gets rid of that and allows tribes to own land communally again. And the Dawes Act also made it illegal for Native Americans to like practice their religions, to like speak native languages, those types of things. The Indian Reorganization Act repeals that as well. It doesn't do, I think, as much as some of the tribes hoped it would, but it is definitely a small step forward, and that is more than we can say for the U.S. government with Native Americans, like at basically any other point in history that we've talked about thus far. So it's not like a massive, leap forward for Native rights, but it is definitely an improvement over the previous policies that were very like assimilation based and kind of anti-tribal custom and tribal rights. African Americans, meanwhile, have a little bit of a more solid place in the New Deal programs themselves. The one thing that you really want to keep in mind with the New Deal, and this is a really common the trick answer that the College Board likes to use a lot, is that the New Deal doesn't do anything to directly like attack segregation or Jim Crow. So all of those Jim Crow laws that exist, all that Plessy versus Ferguson stuff that's going on, separate versus equal, and like the lynching that's happening in the South, all of those like civil rights issues, none of that is what the New Deal deals with at all. So it doesn't tackle any of that, even though Eleanor Roosevelt really wanted it to. It doesn't go quite that far. But it does do something that previous government programs haven't done, and it does actually provide specifically for African American and in some cases Hispanic people to be part of some of these programs. So as the slide notes, several of the big like jobs programs, the Works Progress Administration, which we'll talk about in a sec here, the NYA, the CCC, they set aside like actually part of their money to specifically hire African Americans. And they're, going to be hired, they're working in camps. The picture at the bottom of the slide shows 2 CCC camps, Civilian Conservation Corps camps. So they were segregated almost like units within these various New Deal programs. So it's both a positive in that the government is extending some relief directly to the Black community, but also, again, a continuation or like an acknowledgement or a continuation, I guess the best word, of segregation within the New Deal itself. Kind of at the level of governing, another thing that's going to endear the Black community, or Franklin Roosevelt to the Black community, is going to be the fact that FDR is the first president really to sort of go directly to the Black community for advice about some of his sort of programs and like the New Deal stuff, etc. There's a whole set of about 30 or 40 African Americans who exist in second level positions in the cabinet department. So like not the Secretary of Interior, but like the Assistant Secretary of Interior, that type of thing. They come to be called the Black Cabinet, as you'll see them sometimes, or the Black Brain Trust. And it was an informal advisory group that, when Roosevelt was like, oh, well, how is this program going to impact the Black community? He had these people in the government that he could call on to sort of try to discuss that and give some insight into it. Eleanor Roosevelt, as your textbook mentioned, was really much more progressive than her husband, and she really wanted to see more like direct action against segregation and various things. This is a picture of her with Mary McLeod Bethune. Miss Bethune was probably one of the most famous members of the Black Cabinet. She was in charge of the sort of secondary branch of the WPA called the NYA, the National Youth Administration, for a long time. So she has a nice long career, kind of governmental career, and she and Eleanor Roosevelt were actually like genuinely friends from everything I've read. So that's the role of African Americans in the New Deal. Some doors opened, but not fully. On the other hand, we're going to see a pretty generally almost exclusively negative effect for the New Deal and the Great Depression in general on the Hispanic community of the United States. We actually haven't had, prior to this, a really long history of immigration from Mexico. And when we do talk about Hispanics in this time period, we are largely talking about people from Mexico. There is like a little bit of immigration from like Central America, Latin America, a little bit of, Cuban immigration, that type of stuff. But for the most part, when we talk about Hispanics in the early part of the 20th century, we are largely talking about Mexican immigrants. And so during like World War I, when there was a need for war jobs, we had seen a fairly large like swath of immigration kind of for the first time, and then it continued sort of throughout the 1920s, and then here in the 1930s, once times get bad and like there's a sort of a clamping down on the job market, etc. What we're going to see is the federal government, but actually mostly the state of California and a couple of other western states, are going to focus on this repatriation program. You see that word on the slide here, and this repatriation program it's basically a slightly less awful sounding way of saying like forced deportations. So it was, sort of conducted like door-to-door raids. They would just sort of like drag people out of their homes and put them on trains in the middle of the night and just kind of like dump them across the desert. Los Angeles lost like a third of its Mexican population. That's a very large amount of people. The 500,000 number that I have on the slide is an estimate. We don't have like real strong numbers on this because a lot of it was like sort of undercover and not necessarily carried out through like any sort of due process. There was no, asking if people were in the country legally or illegally. It was just sort of a push of Mexican laborers out of the country. Of course, when World War II rolls around, we're going to see the Bracero program, which is going to invite Mexican workers back in with open arms. And then after World War II, as you may guess, we're going to push them back out. So there's this kind of continual history in the early 20th century of like a push-pull. Whenever the American economy is good, we tend to be pushing Hispanic immigrants out. When the American economy is in need of laborers, we tend to sort of want to pull them in. So that's kind of what's going on here in the 1920s. The repatriation is like a really little discussed aspect of the Great Depression, but definitely a very important one. So when the New Deal is sort of underway, so 1933, 1934, that's kind of when things are rolling out. It's a generally positive reception, again, outside of some of the identity groups that we've talked about. Not everybody is getting helped. New Deal programs are maybe reaching estimates that I've seen. It's like usually about 1 in 10 people or so are being directly impacted by a New Deal program, but people at least feel like something is going on, right? Roosevelt is giving these radio addresses, like there's something happening, there's kind of an energy in the country, but there are people who decide by 1934, 35 that they don't like the New Deal so much. And one of those groups that's going to make that decision is actually the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court in the 1930s was old. I think the average age on the court was like 72. That's bad for an average age. And then in addition to that, they also tended to be more conservative. There was like a 5-4 split in the court, and the 5-person majority was more conservative and really didn't like a lot of what Roosevelt was doing. They thought that he was overreaching, that it was too big of an expansion of executive power, and that he was basically acting unconstitutionally with the New Deal. And so there's 2 really big deal court cases in 35 and 36 that you see on the screen here. This first one, the Schechter-Poultry court case, what this one did is it struck down like basically the heart of the National Recovery Act, the NRA. that you guys did some reading about this week. So they struck down that, again, as just like government overreach, that the government is sort of going too far. And then in the U.S. versus Butler, just a few months later in 36, they struck down the part of the Agricultural Adjustment Agency that like paid farmers to like reduce their production. And so there's a couple of other little like smaller ones too. These are the two that might potentially come up on like a test question. And so what these are, this is a critique of the New Deal from like the conservative side, that the New Deal has gone too far. And we're going to see Roosevelt pushing back against the court in a little bit here as well. So you guys are old enough to know how politics works now, and the fact is that in politics, whenever you've got people on one side of you saying that you have gone too far, what you have on the other side of you is people saying you have not gone far enough, and so those people also exist. Your textbook, I think, talks about these people as presenting panaceas or sort of cure-alls for the common, Great Depression ailment. But basically what they all are is they're all people who are criticizing Roosevelt from like a radical, like liberal type perspective, arguing essentially that the government is not doing enough. All three of them are pretty important. Huey Long over here on the far left is probably the most important. So we'll kind of work backwards. So Francis Townsend, right here on the right, this is actually this gentleman right here, what his major issue was the idea that the government should provide old age pensions for people who hit a certain age. He usually suggested like 60 or 65, that there should essentially be like federally provided retirement, a check that would go to senior citizens, once a month, and then they would have to, like, he wanted to guarantee that they would spend that money in the month, so it goes back into circulation, right, and sort of float the economy in that way. If this is sounding vaguely familiar to you, like if you're like, hey, that's ringing some bells, sounds like Social Security, you are correct, right? Francis Townsend's ideas are going to become Social Security, and we'll talk about that in a few slides. In the center here, we have, this is a tough one, but we have maybe the worst of the three guys. And this is Charles Coughlin, who was a priest, a Catholic priest, who had a big radio show and also a third party that wasn't very serious called the Union Party. And he critiques the New Deal in just a variety. He usually doesn't like Roosevelt, critiques it in a variety of ways. But the one that's probably most well known for, he's got a lot of really virulent, like anti-Semitic rhetoric, a lot of stuff about how the Jewish people are to blame for the Depression and this sort of vast Jewish banking conspiracy type thing that we see. And again, this is like 1935, 1936. That's right exactly at the same time that those same types of words are coming out of Nazi Germany, right? We're right at the same time as like the rise of the Nazis is happening in Germany. So there's some resonance there. And the last guy over here, and like I said, maybe the most kind of like long-term significance, guy named Huey Long. Long was the governor of Louisiana and then the senator from Louisiana in some order that I always get flipped around. They called him the Kingfish, and he was what we often refer to as a demagogue. He was someone who liked to sort of whip the public up with a lot of like empty promises and not necessarily very practical solutions to the problems of the Great Depression, because what he wanted was political power. He was largely like a power seeker. He was a mesmerizing speaker. He would sort of put on a good show, wore, colored clothes and talked like fancy patter, kind of had a very like revivalist, almost ministerial style of speech. You can kind of see in the picture there, him waving his hands. And what he had was this program he called Share the Wealth. And what he was proposing was that he was going to soak the rich. He called it the Soak the Rich program, and that he would, tax the rich at a really, really high level and then redistribute that money to everyone so that everyone would get a government-provided car, everyone would get a government-provided house, like college education, all of those kinds of things. His program completely didn't add up. Like, it was absolutely not a practical thing that could happen, but it was very appealing to a lot of people. And Long is a little scary. I almost kind of think of him sometimes as like a little bit of a political mafia figure. People who didn't agree with him tended not to do very well, it's sometimes in fairly serious ways. He is going to agitate against Roosevelt for quite a while. He's going to try to run against him in 36, but he actually winds up getting shot, not killed, but crippled for life essentially an assassination attempt. In addition to these three guys, just in general, the mid-1930s is a really radical period where we see a rise in membership in third parties, right? People who are sort of dissatisfied. So we're going to see the revival of like a progressive party at a state level, not so much at the national level. Our old buddy Upton Sinclair, who you might remember from writing The Jungle last unit, he lives in California now, and he's going to run for governor of California on a program called EPIC, End Poverty in California, that was basically a socialist platform of like wealth redistribution. The Communist Party of the United States, the Socialist Party, like just gain a lot in this time period because people are frustrated. The 1930s is the only period in American history when more people are leaving the U.S. than coming to the U.S., like when we have essentially a net negative immigration. And a lot of people are worried essentially that like what they're looking at is the demise of democracy, that we have essentially, capitalism has run itself into the ground, and now is the time to try for something new, basically. So harnessing all of this radical energy, FDR is going to decide on a second set of programs, what we very creatively call the Second New Deal, or sometimes the Second 100 Days. So still his first term, notice up here, it's about like 1935, 1936 is when most of these roll out. And the Second New Deal is much more radical and much more like permanent, much more Keynesian, as we talked about, like the pump priming, right? This idea of pumping money into society from the government. It goes further on all of those things than the first New Deal did. The College Board loves to ask you to compare first and second New Deal programs. So it's important that you be able to associate programs with like one of the two, like is this the first New Deal program or is this the second? And then also that you understand that second New Deal programs are more radical, that they're more extreme, that they're like a key understanding to get the New Deal stuff right. So Roosevelt's Second New Deal borrows a lot from his critics. He basically decides that the best way to, to beat him is to join him. That he's going to incorporate a lot of the criticisms into his programs. So you see that Revenue Act down there, which he called the Soak the Rich tax, to sort of incorporate some of Huey Long's rhetoric, even though it wasn't as extreme. It was an actual tax that made sense. So we see a raise in taxes on the wealthy. That was one thing that he does to fund the Second New Deal. And then there's like three really, really super big deal programs for the Second New Deal that you need to know. First one is Social Security. So Social Security comes out of the ideas of Francis Townsend. It starts in 1935, and it is, as I think most of you guys are fairly familiar with the idea of Social Security, it's the idea that people who are working pay in to the fund. So you and your parents and anybody else in your family who currently has a job, you pay into Social Security. And then when you hit 65, right, when you hit retirement age, you get a check every month, essentially back out of the Social Security fund. The thing that is that sometimes people don't understand about Social Security is that you're not necessarily getting back your money. Like they put your money in a box, and then when you turn 65, you get your money back. What you're getting back when you retire is all of the money from the people who are working at the time. So if you have like grandparents who are on Social Security right now, the money that they draw every month is the money that's being paid in by like you if you have a job, or your teachers, right, or anybody who's working right now. This works really well as long as there are more people working than there are people drawing on Social Security. And that wasn't a problem in this time period because the people didn't live quite as long, and the generations sort of fell nicely. You might have heard the concerns maybe about Social Security modern day, and the concern with that in the modern realm is that we have a very large generation called the baby boomers who are getting ready to retire, retiring like right about now. So there are some concerns about like the viability of Social Security. So it's a long-standing program. It's going to wind up being very popular, and then it's going to get expanded out in the 1960s under Lyndon Baines Johnson's Great Society, which we'll talk about a little bit more when we get to that. So Social Security, one of the central New Deal programs. Probably the biggest of the second New Deal programs, though, is the WPA, or the Works Progress Administration. The Works Progress Administration is a jobs program, just like we saw with the PWA and the CCC from the first New Deal, but it's much more like diverse. It contains not only, construction jobs and like shovel jobs, but also it employs, muralists to artists to like, paint murals in public buildings like post offices and in government buildings, etc. If you go into the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. today and you look around, what you're seeing is a lot of New Deal paid for art. That's a very common thing to have. They've got a part of the WPA is the NYA, the National Youth Administration, that does like jobs training programs for kids. What I'm going to click on here, this link that you see in the center of the slide, we're going to go to a quick little detour, is a website called the Living New Deal that tracks all of the like programs that were completed by New Deal organizations, any of them, not just the WPA, but any of them, and then like that are still around today. So when this map pops up here, as you just saw it do, what you're looking at, all of those dots, all of those little tags, those are all things that still exist today that were like built or improved by the New Deal itself. So if we zoom in, let me do this on North Carolina, and then we kind of come over to Chapel Hill. You see that there are at least a couple of things in Chapel Hill today that are still like things that still exist that were built by New Deal programs. I think I'm pretty sure. Let me zoom in on this one. This one that is on the campus is the Forest Hill Theater. If anybody's ever been to the UNC Outdoor Amphitheater where they do some drama performances sometimes, let me take a second to open up here. What the theater was renovated by WPA money, by sort of New Deal money itself. So there's Forest Hill Theater reconstruction. You can see that up there. And so if we go, let's see, let me zoom back out. If we go back to our full map, right, you see how many programs there are just like total. And then if we take this and we filter, if you take a look at all of these agencies, how many there are. Those are all New Deal agencies. If we take a look at this, we just scroll to the WPA, just the one that we're talking about right now, and then we apply that. You can see, I mean, just that one program, like what a big percentage of the actual like physical impact of the New Deal that is. You know, everything from, again, bridges to like writers projects, etc. So really, really, really big deal program. One aspect of the WPA that you have probably run into before, even if you didn't know it, is that the WPA pays photographers to go around the country and take pictures documenting the conditions of the Great Depression. This is why, if you haven't maybe thought about it before, this is why we have so many like really good quality pictures of life in the Great Depression, because the government actually paid people to do that. And one of the WPA photographers is this lady down here on her car. Her name is Dorothea Lange. And she takes what's probably, I think, the most famous image of the Great Depression, this image here called Migrant Mother. So that photograph is very specifically associated with the WPA photographer project, and that's a piece of information you might need to know. Okay. So that's Social Security and the WPA, two key programs from the second New Deal, excuse me. The last of the really big second New Deal programs that you need to know something about is the NLRA, the National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act. Unfortunately, you do kind of need to know both of those names. What it does is it sets up a regulatory board. That's the National Labor Relations Board, very, very surprisingly. And it specifically it specifically makes it so that employers can't stop unions from forming. So last unit during the Guild Age, when you guys did some reading and research about unions like the AFL and the Knights of Labor, one thing that should have struck you was how little power they had compared to the employers. There's so many things employers can do. They can blacklist people. They could fire you just for being a union member. They could have a closed shop where they would refuse to even hire you if you'd been associated with unions in the past. They could bring in, you know, detectives to bust heads, right? All that kind of stuff. The NLRA makes most of that illegal. And importantly, sets up a regulatory board, that NLRB, to monitor and make sure that employers are sort of following the law. And so if you take a look at this image down here, what you're looking at is the like membership in labor unions. And you can see from 1900 into the 1930s, like it's relatively small, little spike right here after World War I. We kind of talked about that. There was like a little radical spike after the war, but, you know, quickly suppressed by all of these, you know, head-breaking managers. But here in 1935, when the Wagner Act passes, it's just like this explosion of union membership. We're even going to create a new union, which we'll talk about right on here on the next slide. So the NLRA is a really important piece of legislation. I think it's hard to argue, I think, that this is maybe the most important piece of labor union legislation in American history. Some of its provisions are still in effect today. Some of it gets rolled back in the 1950s, which we'll talk about when we get to that. But that's the NLRA. So those are the three most important second New Deal programs: Social Security, the WPA, and the NLRA, the Wagner Act. The Wagner Act happens right around the same time as we see the formation of a new union, so CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. I want to take a quick pause here to make sure that you guys don't do something that a lot of people do, and that is confuse the CIO with a New Deal program. It sort of seems like it should be one. It's got an acronym. It's like right around the same time, but it's a labor union, right? Just like the American Federation of Labor or the Knights of Labor. It's started by this guy, John Lewis, not Congressman John Lewis, but United Mine Worker President John Lewis, and it's going to industrialize. There's going to, unionize by industry. So like mine workers, auto workers, those kinds of things. So it's the CIO. As you can see by this last slide that we were on, it grows pretty quickly. And then eventually in the 1950s, the CIO and the AFL merge into the extremely creatively named AFL-CIO, and that's still the largest labor union in the country today. Okay. So all of this second New Deal stuff takes place essentially while Roosevelt is campaigning for re-election. And as you can see by the electoral map on the screen, it goes pretty well for him. This is, at the time, the largest electoral landslide in American history. And it's still one of, if not the biggest popular vote landslide in American history. You can see over here it's 61%. That's a very, very large margin. We don't see that very often. So there's a clear mandate here, right? People are clearly saying, okay, even if the New Deal isn't perfect, the Depression hasn't ended, we at least approve of the direction that the Roosevelt administration is going in. The 1936 election is super, super, super significant because it represents the beginning of the modern day Democratic Party. So the Democrats have always, since the Civil War at least, been the party of white Southerners, right? That's not new. That's that old solid South that we've had since the Civil War. And then ethnic minorities, that's not really new either, right? That's mostly our urban voters, like our Irish immigrants and stuff like that, who, supported, like, say, Tammany Hall in New York, or those kinds of people. So those top two are not new. But what we've added to the Democratic Party here in 1976, and what we're going to keep for a long time, are union members. So pretty much from the National Labor Relations Act all the way, arguably, up until just this last election, union members have been a key demographic, voting bloc for the Democratic Party. And then African Americans for the first time as well. So remember, we don't have a lot of African Americans voting because of poll taxes, literacy clauses, those kinds of things. But the ones who are voting in this time period have now switched their allegiance from the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, to the Democratic Party, the party of FDR, and they still remain there today. So if you take a look at this list, you might notice some potential tensions. Like if you look at this and you think, okay, which two of these groups are not going to get along in the Democratic Party, you might correctly settle on white Southerners and African Americans. And so the question that the Democratic Party has to solve now is this the party of white Southerners, dominated by white Southerners, that are going to tolerate African Americans for their votes, which is kind of how FDR operates? Or is this a party that's genuinely going to address concerns of African Americans like civil rights, in which case it's probably going to alienate the white Southerners? And that is where the party is going to get to eventually, but not until the 1960s. So from the 1930s to the 1960s, about 30 years of kind of an uneasy coalition in the Democratic Party here. So FDR's second term is a lot less, it's a lot less active domestically. I won't say a lot less active because, World War II starts. But the one thing that you need to know about his second term is this court packing plan. This is easily the most unpopular thing Roosevelt does. He's still kind of angry about the court striking down a bunch of his New Deal programs. So he decides on a new congressional rule that allows one additional justice to be appointed for every justice who's over 70 years and 6 months old, which basically means he would get to add 6 justices. And remember, of course, that presidents get to choose Supreme Court justices. So this is a fairly thinly veiled attempt by Roosevelt to pack the court with justices who will support his his New Deal programs. This does not go down well. A lot of people very correctly see this as a violation of checks and balances, and Roosevelt trying to control the court, etc. Luckily for him, he has to kind of pull back from this plan. But luckily for him, one of the justices in that 5-person majority is going to shift sides on a few key cases, and then a couple of the gentlemen are old enough to either die off or retire. So he does eventually wind up with a more pro-New Deal Supreme Court, but not through this court packing plan. Some foreign policy stuff on here. We're mostly domestic focused up to this point. The big thing down here is this big good neighbor policy. This is FDR rolling back his distant cousin TR's more imperialistic stance. We've been real heavily involved in Latin America for a while. Like every time there's a problem in Haiti or the Dominican or Chile, Argentina, down in Central America and Latin America and South America, we've been interfering really heavily, and FDR is going to roll that back a lot because it turns out that people don't like that when we send our army in to occupy their country. So in general, what you're taking a look at here is one measure of the Great Depression. This is a graph of unemployment, which is hard to measure, but is a good way of looking at what's going on. So we see unemployment right here, right before the crash. Here's the stock market crash. You can see it skyrocket up to some ungodly number. Here is 32 election. FDR becomes president. Lame duck period, right? He's inaugurated, and this is like the first New Deal, second New Deal, right? And it's not, back down to where we were, but a nice, solid downward trend that makes people feel good. Unfortunately, here in 1937, we're going to see another mini recession. This is like just one of those economic blips. There's a lot of different arguments about why it happened. Was it New Deal policies? Was it inevitable? Blah, blah, blah. But you can imagine, after like 8 years of depression at this point, people weren't super happy about this. And so one of the reasons why we stay out of World War II for as long as we do, I think, is partially just because we're so deeply consumed still by some of this economic stuff. It's not really until here's 1939. This is when Germany invades Poland and World War II begins in Europe. And then down here is the bombing of Pearl Harbor when the United States joins World War II. And so you can see it's really not until World War II starts, and then even more dramatically when the U.S. joins World War II, that we really fully come out of the Great Depression. Like if you're looking, when did we get back to our draw a relatively straight line. When we get back to our pre-depression unemployment, it's pretty much right after Pearl Harbor. So it really is World War II that ends the depression. But the New Deal does a lot to help and to sort of get the country through bad times, not to be too cheesy. So things that's like the College Board loves to test you on like what the New Deal does and does not do. You can kind of take a pause at this or check this out on the online slides. There's some good stuff to know in here, most of which I've already emphasized. Same thing with this enduring understanding. Again, the New Deal does not end the Depression, but it leaves a legacy of reforms and regulatory agencies, right, like the FDIC or the SEC, fosters a long-term political realignment, right? We talked about this just now, right? Realigning with the Democratic Party. General effects of the Great Depression. Really big one is kind of these first two combined up here. The New Deal creates a large government that we have never gone back from, right? Before the New Deal and the 150-ish years of history of the United States before the New Deal, we kind of went back and forth. We were mostly laissez-faire. We'd get a little bigger. We'd go back to laissez-faire. We'd get a little bigger. We'd go back to laissez-faire. But after the New Deal, we have never, ever been anything that you could call laissez-faire again. We've had administrations like Reagan's that have tried to shrink the size of the government, but never back to anywhere near laissez-faire levels. So it's a permanent increase in the size of the government and also in the degree of control that the government has over the economy. Most of this other stuff is fairly self-explanatory down here, right? All this permanent agencies, we should talk about that a lot as well. And if you take a look at the note sets online, you'll find this last little segment that just hits a little bit on some of the cultural stuff in the 1930s that your textbook covers. So you can take a look through that at your leisure. It's an interesting period of the golden age of Hollywood. These are all pictures that were up for Best Academy Award in 1939. Oscars, it's arguably like the most competitive Best Picture. It's a lot of like really big deal. It's Snow White, Disney's first full-length animated feature, right? So there's a lot of big stuff of that nature going on. So a little bit less important though. So we've come to the end of our Great Depression notes. Again, one of the most important turning points in American history. And when we pick back up, we will be taking a look at World War II, or the road to World War II, which happens basically during the Depression, and then the war itself and its impact on the United States. Thank you guys very much for your time.